In the heart of Oklahoma, where the sky stretches wider than the land itself, there was a farm that refused to let anyone go hungry. Not one family, not two, but 10 families, year after year, for decades. This is the story of how 300 acres of red dirt became something more than land. It became a lifeline, a promise, and a quiet rebellion against the idea that people have to face hard times alone. The soil wasn't rich. The rain didn't always come when it was needed. The winters could break a man's spirit, and the summers could burn everything he'd built. But the people who worked that land understood something most had forgotten in the rush toward bigger, faster, more profitable. They understood that survival isn't about what you own. It's about what you're willing to share, when sharing is all that stands between your neighbor and hunger. It started in the spring of 1953, when a man named Samuel bought those 300 acres with every dollar he'd saved from 15 years of working oil rigs across the state. He was 32 years old, married to a woman named Dorothy, who grew up on a farm in Kansas, and they had 2 children, a boy named Michael, age 7, and a girl named Sarah, just 5. Samuel had grown up poor, the kind of poor where you learn to make one chicken feed 8 people for 3 days. He'd promised himself that his children would never know that kind of hunger, that they'd have land under their feet and food on their table, no matter what. The land he bought wasn't pretty. It had been neglected for years, left fallow by a previous owner who'd given up during the Dust Bowl and never came back. The farmhouse was small, just 4 rooms with gaps in the walls where the wind whistled through on cold nights. The barn leaned to one side like it was tired of standing. But Samuel saw something else when he looked at that land. He saw rows of wheat, golden in the sun. He saw cattle grazing in the pasture. He saw his children running through fields that belonged to them, truly belonged to them, in a way nothing else ever had. That first year was backbreaking. Samuel and Dorothy worked from before sunrise until after dark, clearing rocks from the fields, repairing the barn, planting wheat by hand when the old tractor they'd bought broke down 3 times in 1 week. Michael and Sarah helped however they could, carrying water, feeding the chickens they'd bought from a neighbor, pulling weeds from the vegetable garden Dorothy had planted behind the house. By September, when the wheat was ready for harvest, Samuel's hands were calloused and bleeding. His back ached in ways he'd never felt before, but the crop was good, better than good. He'd grown enough to feed his family for a year, with plenty left over to sell. He took the surplus to market in town, sold it for a fair price, and came home with enough money to buy a better tractor and some cattle. Dorothy canned vegetables until their small pantry overflowed with jars of tomatoes, green beans, and corn. That winter, when the snow came and covered everything in white silence, the family sat around their wood stove and ate well. Samuel felt something he hadn't felt in years: security. The sense that he'd finally built something solid, something that couldn't be taken away. But then came the summer of 1956, and everything changed. It started in June when the rain stopped. At first, no one worried. Oklahoma summers were always dry, but by July the fields had turned brown and brittle. The wheat that should have been growing tall and green was stunted, barely a foot high. Samuel watched the sky every morning, looking for clouds that never came. He watched his neighbors' farms turn to dust, watched families load their possessions onto trucks and leave for California, for anywhere that might offer work and water. By August, it was clear. The drought wasn't ending. The harvest would be a disaster. Samuel managed to save about 40% of his crop. It wasn't much, but it was more than most. His neighbors, families he'd known since he moved there, people who'd helped him repair his barn and shared meals at church potlucks, had lost everything. The Hendersons, who lived 2 miles down the road with 3 young children. The Pratts, an older couple who'd been farming that land for 30 years. The Williamson family, the Coopers, the McDonalds. One by one, Samuel heard the same story. No crop, no income, and winter coming fast. He watched the Henderson children at church one Sunday in September. They were thin, too thin, and they didn't run and play like children should. They sat quietly beside their parents, their eyes hollow with the kind of hunger that goes deeper than an empty stomach. That night, Samuel couldn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table, looking at the numbers he'd written in his ledger. He had enough wheat to feed his family through the winter and spring. If he sold the rest, he'd have money to buy seed for next year, maybe fix the roof that had started leaking in the back bedroom. It was the sensible thing to do, the smart thing. But when he closed his eyes, all he could see were those children. The next morning, Samuel loaded half of his stored wheat into his truck. He drove to the Henderson farm and knocked on the door. When Mrs. Henderson answered, he told her he had extra wheat he needed to get rid of before it went bad. A lie, but a kind one. She tried to refuse. She had pride, and taking charity hurt that pride more than hunger hurt her stomach. But Samuel was insistent. He unloaded the wheat into their barn, refused payment, and drove away before she could argue further. He did the same at the Pratt farm, then the Williamsons, the Coopers, the McDonalds. By the end of the week, he'd given away more than half of what he'd harvested. Dorothy didn't question him when she saw how little was left in their own barn. She'd grown up during the Depression, and she understood that sometimes survival meant making sure your neighbor survived too. Word spread quietly through the community, not as gossip, but as something else, a kind of quiet amazement that someone would choose to give rather than keep, especially in hard times. The families Samuel helped didn't forget. When spring came and it was time to plant, they showed up at his farm without being asked. The Henderson men brought their plow. The Pratt's son, who was strong as an ox, helped clear a new field Samuel had wanted to expand into. The Williamson women brought food and worked alongside Dorothy in the garden, planting twice as many vegetables as the year before. It wasn't organized. No one made speeches or formal agreements. It was simply understood. Samuel had shared when he didn't have to, and now they would share their labor, their time, their strength. The farm became a collective effort, though no one would have called it that. They would have called it neighboring. They would have called it the right thing to do. The harvest of 1957 was better. The rains came back, and the wheat grew tall and thick. This time, when Samuel calculated what he'd grown, he didn't hesitate. He divided it evenly, half for his family and their needs, half for the others. He added 4 more families to the list: the Johnsons, the Reeds, the Ortiz family who'd moved from Texas, and old widow Patterson who lived alone in a house that was falling apart around her. 10 families total, all fed from one farm. Some tried to pay him. He refused every time. "We all eat or none of us do," became his standard answer, delivered with a slight smile and a firm handshake that ended the conversation. He meant it. To Samuel, it wasn't charity. It was something more fundamental than that. It was the recognition that he and his neighbors were bound together by more than just proximity. They were bound by the simple fact that when times got hard, and times always got hard, people needed each other. The years rolled forward like the seasons. Summer heat gave way to autumn harvests, which gave way to winter cold, which gave way to spring planting. The children grew. Michael became a teenager, tall and strong like his father, taking on more responsibility on the farm each year. Sarah learned to drive the tractor when she was 13, her small hands confident on the wheel as she plowed straight furrows across the fields. The other family's children worked alongside them. They became something more than neighbors' kids. They became almost like cousins, bound together by shared labor and shared meals. By the early 1960s, the arrangement had become tradition. Every harvest was divided. Every family received their share, delivered personally by Samuel or by the older children who were now strong enough to load and unload the heavy sacks of grain. The families didn't just receive, though. They came to work. Spring planting became a community event, with 20 or 30 people in the fields, working in the cool morning air while the children ran between the rows and the women prepared lunch that everyone would share under the shade of the old oak tree beside the barn. There were hard years. In 1963, a late frost killed half the wheat crop just as it was starting to head out. In 1967, wheat prices dropped so low that Samuel barely made enough to buy seed for the next year. In 1971, his best tractor, the one he'd worked so hard to buy nearly 20 years earlier, threw a rod and died in the middle of harvest. Each time the 10 families pooled together, they brought tools, labor, whatever they had. When the tractor died, 3 of the families chipped in to help buy a used replacement. When the frost hit, they all worked longer hours to salvage what they could. Samuel never asked for help. That wasn't his way. But the help came anyway, offered freely, given without expectation of return. The farm had become more than his, it had become theirs, in a sense that had nothing to do with legal ownership and everything to do with shared investment, shared sweat, shared hope. The 1970s brought changes. The world was different. Corporate farms were buying up smaller operations, consolidating land into massive agricultural enterprises run with computers and chemicals and efficiency that small farmers couldn't match. Young people were leaving rural areas for cities, chasing jobs and opportunities that didn't involve dawn-to-dusk labor in dusty fields. Several of Samuel's neighbors sold their farms and moved away. The community that had been so tight-knit began to fray, but the 10 families stayed. Their children, now adults themselves, had been raised with the understanding that the farm was part of their lives, woven into their identities as surely as their own names. Michael, Samuel's son, had gone to college and gotten a degree in agricultural science, but he came back. He could have taken a job with a large agricultural company, made 3 times the money. Instead, he came home to work beside his father, applying new techniques to improve yields while maintaining the same commitment to sharing the harvest. The other family's children made similar choices, not all of them. Some moved away, found different lives, but enough stayed that when harvest time came, there were still young, strong backs to do the work. The second generation understood what their parents had built, even if they couldn't quite articulate it. They understood that the farm represented something rare and precious, a working model of mutual aid, of community in its truest sense. Samuel's health began to fail in the mid-1980s. He was in his 60s by then, and the decades of hard labor had taken their toll. His back, which had ached since that first year of breaking new ground, now hurt constantly. His hands, gnarled and stiff with arthritis, could barely grip a wrench or a steering wheel. He tried to hide it, kept working even when the pain made him gasp, but Dorothy and the others could see it. They could see him moving slower, see him wincing when he lifted something heavy, see him sitting down more often to rest. The families gathered one evening in September of 1987, after the harvest was done. All 10 families, parents and adult children, crowded into Samuel and Dorothy's small farmhouse. They'd brought food. It was supposed to be a harvest celebration, the kind they'd had every year for 3 decades. But everyone knew this meeting was about something else. Jim Henderson, who'd been one of those hungry children back in 1956 and was now a man in his 40s with children of his own, stood up. He was a quiet man, not given to long speeches, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Samuel," he said, "you've been feeding our families for 30 years. You've given us more than food. You've given us a way to stay here, to keep our kids in these communities, to not have to leave everything behind and start over somewhere else. We want you to know that we don't take that for granted. We never have." There was a murmur of agreement from everyone in the room. Jim continued, "We've been talking, all of us, and we know you can't do this forever. None of us can. But we don't want this to end. This farm, what it represents, what it's meant to all of us, we want to keep it going. So we have a proposal." He laid out a plan they'd been working on for months. The 10 families would formally organize, pool their resources, and take over the heaviest labor. Michael would manage the day-to-day operations. He had the knowledge and the skill, but all the families would contribute work hours. They'd rotate responsibilities, planting, maintenance, harvest. The crops would still be divided equally, just as they always had been. And Samuel and Dorothy could step back, rest, let others carry the load they'd been carrying for so long. Samuel listened with tears in his eyes. He'd never expected anything in return for what he'd done. The sharing had been its own reward, born from his own memories of childhood hunger and his conviction that people should take care of each other. But to see these families, some of them now in their second generation, committed to continuing what he'd started, that moved him in ways he couldn't express. He simply nodded. "Let's keep it going," he said. And they did. Samuel passed away in the winter of 1989. It was peaceful. He died in his sleep in the house he'd lived in for 36 years, with Dorothy beside him. The funeral was held at the small church in town, and it was packed. Not just the 10 families, but neighbors from miles around, people who'd heard stories about the farm and the man who'd chosen sharing over profit, community over competition. After the funeral, there was a question everyone wondered, but no one wanted to ask. What would happen to the farm? Samuel's children, Michael and Sarah, legally owned it. They could sell it, take the money, move on with their lives. The land was worth a substantial amount by then. Developers were starting to look at rural Oklahoma, seeing potential for subdivisions and strip malls. But Michael and Sarah had been raised on that farm, had grown up understanding its purpose. At a meeting 2 weeks after Samuel's death, they made an announcement. They were willing to sell the farm to the 10 families together. For a price so low, it was practically a gift, spread out over payments that none of the families would struggle to make. It took some legal maneuvering, some creative paperwork, but by spring of 1990, the farm was owned collectively by the 10 families. They formed a kind of cooperative, though they didn't use fancy terms or create elaborate bylaws. They kept it simple. Everyone worked, everyone shared in the harvest, decisions were made together. Michael managed the operations, but he answered to the group. The work continued. The 1990s brought new challenges: droughts, equipment breakdowns, changes in agricultural markets that made small-scale farming increasingly difficult. But the families adapted. They diversified, adding vegetable crops and a small cattle operation. They learned about organic farming methods and started selling at farmers' markets, which brought in additional income. The farm evolved, but its core purpose remained the same. The children of the second generation grew up working those fields, just as their parents had. They learned to drive tractors, to plant and harvest, to fix equipment when it broke. They learned the rhythms of the seasons and the satisfaction of hard work. Most importantly, they learned the values their grandparents had lived by, that community matters more than individual gain, that taking care of each other is not a burden but a privilege, that the land is not just a resource to be exploited, but a trust to be maintained. Some of them left for college, for careers in cities, for lives that didn't involve dirt under their fingernails and early mornings in the fields. But others stayed, and still others returned after years away, discovering that what they'd left behind was more valuable than what they'd found elsewhere. By the 2000s, the third generation was taking over primary responsibility for the farm, with the second generation now in the role of advisors and supporters. The world around them continued to change. Factory farming dominated agriculture. Small towns across the Midwest emptied out as young people left for urban areas. The family farm, that iconic image of American life, was becoming an anachronism, a relic of a past that seemed quaint and unsustainable in the modern economy. But that one farm in Oklahoma kept going. There were moments of crisis. In 2008, during the financial crash, 2 of the families faced foreclosure on their homes. The other 8 families took out loans and pooled money to help them. In 2011, a tornado came within a mile of the farm, destroying a neighbor's property and making everyone realize how fragile their arrangement really was. They bought insurance, created emergency funds, prepared for disasters that might come. Through it all, the harvest continued. Every fall the wheat was gathered, the corn was picked, the vegetables were collected. Every fall the crops were divided among 10 families, now in their 3rd and 4th generations. Children who'd never known Samuel personally knew his story, knew why the farm existed, understood the commitment their families had made. The methods changed with time. The old tractors were replaced with newer, more efficient models. Irrigation systems were installed to guard against drought. Computer programs helped track yields and plan crop rotations. But the fundamental practice remained unchanged. Everyone worked, everyone shared, no one went hungry. There were tensions, of course. Any long-term collective endeavor has conflicts, disagreements about which crops to plant, how to allocate resources, who should do which jobs. Some years, some families felt they were doing more work than others. Some years, personality conflicts threatened to tear apart what decades of cooperation had built, but they always found ways through it. They talked, they compromised, they remembered why they were doing this in the first place. By 2020, the farm had been operating under its collective model for 70 years. 70 years of shared labor and shared harvests. The original 10 families had grown into extended networks, cousins and in-laws and friends who'd married into the community and been welcomed into the work. The farm had expanded slightly, buying adjacent parcels when they became available, now covering nearly 500 acres. The COVID-19 pandemic tested them in ways they hadn't expected. Supply chains broke down, making it difficult to get seed and equipment. Markets closed, eliminating some of their income streams. But the farm kept producing food, and that food kept the 10 families fed when grocery stores had empty shelves and people in cities were struggling to find basic necessities. The old model, producing food for direct consumption rather than purely for profit, suddenly seemed not quaint but wise, not inefficient but resilient. New people started asking questions. Journalists came to write stories about this unusual farm. Researchers studying alternative agricultural models wanted to understand how it worked. Young people interested in sustainable farming and cooperative economics visited to learn. The families were gracious with their time, willing to share what they'd learned, but they were careful to emphasize that they didn't have all the answers. They just found something that worked for them, something rooted in their specific history and relationships. The land itself showed the marks of 70 years of cultivation. The soil, which had been depleted and tired when Samuel first bought it, was now rich and dark, built up by decades of careful stewardship, crop rotation, and organic matter. The old oak tree beside the barn had grown massive, its branches providing shade for lunch breaks, just as they had for 3 generations. The farmhouse had been expanded and renovated multiple times, but parts of the original structure remained, a tangible link to that first year when Samuel and Dorothy had started building something they couldn't have fully imagined. Today, in 2026, the farm still stands. It's not the same farm Samuel bought in 1953. How could it be? The people have changed, the equipment has changed, the methods have changed, but the essential spirit, the core commitment, remains. 10 families, now spanning 4 generations, still work that land together, still plant together, harvest together, share together. The youngest workers now are the great-grandchildren of those families Samuel helped through the drought of 1956. They're teenagers and young adults who've grown up knowing that farming is not just a job or a business. It's a way of life built on mutual dependence and mutual care. Some will stay, continuing the tradition into a 5th generation. Others will leave, finding their paths elsewhere. But they'll all carry with them the knowledge that there's another way to live, another way to organize work and resources and community. The fields stretch out under that wide Oklahoma sky, wheat golden in the late summer sun, just as Samuel once imagined. The barn, rebuilt twice but standing on the same foundation, still leans slightly to one side. A quirk that no one has bothered to fix because it reminds them where they came from. The sound of tractors and voices, of work being done by people who choose to be there, fills the air during planting and harvest seasons. It's not perfect. The work is still hard. The weather is still unpredictable. The economics of small-scale farming are still challenging. They're not wealthy by modern standards, but they eat well. They know their neighbors. They have a stake in something larger than themselves. a project that connects them to the past and points toward a future where maybe people remember that we survive best when we survive together. The land doesn't ask for much, just care, attention, and respect. The people give it that, and in return it gives them food, purpose, and connection. It's a simple exchange, ancient and true, playing out in one small corner of Oklahoma while the rest of the world rushes past, chasing things that gleam brighter but nourish less. And in that simplicity, in that commitment to sharing rather than hoarding, to community rather than isolation, there's something worth holding on to. Not as a relic or a curiosity, but as a quiet reminder that the ways we've been told things must be are not the only ways things can be. That 300 acres of red dirt can feed more than just the people who own it, if those people choose to make it so. That hard times don't have to mean turning inward, protecting only your own, leaving others to fend for themselves. The sun sets over the farm the way it always has, painting the sky in shades of orange and red and purple. The work is done for another day. People head home to their own houses, their own families, carrying with them grain and vegetables grown in soil they all helped tend. Tomorrow they'll be back, because the work never truly ends. But they don't mind. This is what they've chosen. What generations before them chose, what generations after them might choose if the example holds. One farm, 10 families, decades of shared labor, shared harvests, shared survival. It's not a miracle or a fantasy. It's just what happens when people decide that taking care of each other matters more than getting ahead alone. When they understand that a harvest is sweeter when it's divided, that work is lighter when it's shared, that the land gives more when it's tended by many hands working toward a common good. The farm endures, not because it's easy, but because enough people have decided it's worth it. And maybe that's all that's ever needed, enough people deciding that something is worth keeping, worth working for, worth passing on. The rest takes care of itself. Season after season, year after year, generation after generation, until the distinction between what was and what is and what will be blurs into one continuous act of cultivation, of care, of choosing each other over and over again,